Good morning, everyone. I see we have several people on the line already, so I just want to say hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the June Professional Development webinar for the North Central Region Aging Network. I am really excited today to introduce Dr. Robert Nix. Dr. Nix is one of my colleagues here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is an associate professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies and a state specialist for the Division of Extension here at UW-Madison in diverse and underserved children, families, and communities. And I am very excited to introduce him today because he's going to be telling us a little bit more about brief interventions and the potential that that has to really improve our programming and change the way that we deliver programs and think about programs in the context of families, as well as extending to the broader context of aging and communities. So with that, I am going to hand it off to Dr. Nix, and I will point out before we start, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box, and when we get to the end of the presentation, there will be some time for questions. So feel free to type those into the chat box, or if you're able to unmute yourself and ask questions at the end, you're welcome to do that as well. And when we're done, I will also post an evaluation link in the chat box for everyone to fill out because we love your feedback. So with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Nix. And Dr. Nix, we're looking forward
to— Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, everybody, for joining this morning. I'm really excited to be here and to share with you some interesting ideas that I've been thinking about lately. Given that, I'm fairly informal, if you all have questions in the middle, it's fine to unmute yourself and just ask the question too. And this can be more of a conversation than a strict presentation if you feel comfortable with that. Otherwise, it's totally fine to go ahead and submit comments to the chat box, and Kristen can monitor that and we'll address them afterwards. But I'm happy to go either way. So the point today is to talk about this distinction between nudge interventions, brief interventions, and the prevention education programs that we typically offer in extension. We also want to identify ways to use each of these different approaches to extend the continuum of programming and extension. A few years ago, I was at a conference and I saw a presentation on social psychology and the way that it could be used to adapt and create new intervention programs. And my background is in clinical psychology, and I was just struck by how innovative and interesting some of these approaches were, and how in clinical psychology we really didn't know about this really exciting area of research that was happening in our sister field. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of those kinds of findings, and I would be really interested in hearing how you all think that we might be able to apply some of them to the work that we do in extension. And just a quick caveat too, I work in the area of extension with young children and their parents, and so I'm not as familiar with the work that Kristen and all of you do in aging. And so I'll be depending on you to kind of help me make that leap of how some of these ideas might apply to some of the work that you're doing. Okay. So this is a drawing of a fly, but it's a special fly. It's actually a decal that the head of custodial services in the Amsterdam airport had pasted in all of the urinals in 1992. And what he found was that quote unquote spillage decreased by 80% after putting in these decals. And that resulted in an overall savings of 8% for the all of the cleaning at the airport. And for a place as big as an international airport, that could be quite extensive. So this is a great example of a nudge intervention. And nudge interventions are defined as choices, a choice that people are given that changes their behavior in a predictable way without giving them anything or forbidding any options. You don't make it impossible to do the wrong thing, but you make it easier to do the right thing. Richard Thaler is one of the economists who's at University of Chicago who has done the most research on these interventions, and he won the Nobel Prize in 2018 for this work. There are several different mechanisms of action for these nudge interventions. And so I'm going to review a few of them and talk about some examples of research with each one. The first one is an appeal to identity. We want to capitalize on the fact that people will behave in ways that are consistent with how they think of themselves. So you all have probably seen these kinds of signs in hotel bathrooms, right? And when a hotel puts a sign like this in their bathroom, typically about 35% of guests are likely to reuse their towels on any given night. If the signs are changed so that this is the wording, right? In a study conducted in the fall of 2003, 75% of hotel guests participated in our new resource savings program by using their towels more than once. You can join your fellow guests in this program to help save the environment by reusing your towels during your stay. You can get the number by changing the wording of that previous sign to this wording. You can get the reuse rate on any given night up from 35% all the way to 44%. So we know 75% are reusing their towels during their stay, but on any given night, you can actually move it up from 35% to 44%. If you change the wording, tweak the wording in this way, so that instead of 75% of the guests who stayed in this hotel, but rather 75% of the guests who stayed in this particular room that you're staying in, you can actually get that number up to 49%, right? And so just changing the wording of these signs can actually have a huge cost savings for the hotels. It's interesting when we look at the way people identify themselves, right? People think of themselves as a citizen of a particular country, as a man or a woman, as somebody who's environmentally concerned, as a hotel guest at the particular hotel they're staying at, or as a guest of a particular room, right? And you can see that that identity as the guest of a particular room is least salient to people, and yet it was most important for changing their behavior. And what this shows is that regardless of how people self-identify, normative appeals are most effective when describing group behavior that occurred in the setting most relevant to one's immediate circumstances. A second mechanism of action for some of these nudge interventions has to do with the norm of reciprocity. Basically, if you do something nice for people, they're more likely to return the favor. In those examples of the hotel reusage, some hotels would have a sign that said, if you reuse your towels, this hotel will make a donation on behalf of its guests, versus this hotel has already made a donation on behalf of its guests, please do your part. And just that small tweak in the words of the signs increased reuse rates by 45%. You all may have seen these baskets full of candy at the right next to the cash registers of some restaurants. They have also looked at the effect of those on the amount of tips that waiters receive. So they did the study where they had the basket of hospitality mints, is what they're called, on the counter next to their cash register, and that had absolutely no effect on the amount of tips that people were writing in for their on their credit card receipts. Versus if the waiter brought you a piece of chocolate for each guest when he or she gave you the bill, that increased the amount of tip for that waiter by 3%. If the waiter brought you 2 pieces of candy for each guest at your table, that increased the amount of tips by 14%. However, if the waiter, brought 1 piece of candy for each guest at the table, walked away, and then turned around and was like, you know what, here, have another piece of candy, that increased the amount of tips by 23%. So when that waiter showed you that you were special, you were more likely to return the favor. And that's a nice example of that kind of norm of reciprocity. What are some authentic and non-patronizing ways that we can show our families or the clients that we work with an extension that they're special? And I think that that's one of the issues that we're always thinking about in family livings programs. Third mechanism of action is this power of a rationale. If you offer a reason, people are more likely to comply with the request. This is some research by Ellen Langer, where she went into a Kinko's and she had some people say, excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine? Asking others if it would be okay if they cut in front of her or if she could cut in front of them at the line. And when she asked that in just that way, about 60% of people would say, yeah, you can cut in front of me. That's no problem. However, if Dr. Langer and her collaborators said, excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I'm in a rush? Then the percentage of people who would allow her to cut in front of them went all the way up to 94%. In an interesting twist, she also had this condition where described in the 3rd bullet, where she said, excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I have to make copies, right? Of course, everybody in that line everybody is standing in that line because they have to make copies. But people are so primed to respond to this rationale that 93% of people allowed her to cut in. So it went from 60% to 94%, but even with the bogus explanation or rationale, she still got up to 93%. So it's really important that in all of the work that we do, we're careful to provide explanations for what we do with our clients. When I work with families, I always make sure that parents provide rationale for their directions to their children or their requests or commands for their children, even if their children might not understand all of that reasoning. A 4th mechanism of change is changing these perceptual norms. Oftentimes people aren't even aware of the forces that are influencing their actions. This is some work from Marcus Brower, who's in the psychology department here at UW-Madison. He had this poster, which you can see says, what makes us the same is that we're all different. And then it describes some of these people as joyful, some as generous, some as stingy, some as sad, some as warm, pessimistic, optimistic, or cold, right? And he put those posters up in the waiting room while people were waiting to take part in an experiment. There were 6 posters up and only this poster varied, right? So you either had that poster or you had a poster with the same pictures, but a message about the importance of eating fruits and vegetables. Right? After people completed their study, they were told, you can pick up your payment in a room down the hall. As they were walking to that hall, a Confederate coming the other direction accidentally, quote unquote, dropped her bag, right? And if people, and the Confederate was black in that case, if people had been in the waiting room where that poster with the descriptions of Black people had been things like cold, stingy, warm, optimistic, generous, then the amount of people who stopped and helped the Confederate pick up her bag went from 59% to 91%, right? So just being exposed to the fact that people of other races are heterogeneous increased people's positive pro-social behavior in that context. They've done similar studies here where the results were a poster in a physical therapy waiting room. And if any of you have ever been in a physical therapy, you know that you have to go back to that same setting multiple times for a short period. So you might have 3 or 4 physical therapy appointments in a particular week. And they put that poster in the physical therapy room. And then they looked at things like, if a Black person who was a Confederate for the study came in, how close were other people to, or how likely were people to sit in the seat adjacent to that Black Confederate? And what they saw is they also got an increase in, just that kind of behavioral outcome. What's most interesting about this research is the effect is not as strong when the poster was only positive. So if they didn't include a couple of people on that poster who were described as stingy or cold, right, then the participants were resistant to the attempts to influence their behavior. So it can't be that we're just trying to help people see people in other groups as different than they are, or as similar to themselves, but rather that there's heterogeneity in each of these populations. One of the things that we're constantly thinking about here in Wisconsin is, where most of our communities are predominantly white, is are there opportunities that we could be taking advantage of to promote that tolerance for the sake of our our residents of color in those communities, but also for the sake of the white members of those communities. This is becoming a global society, and our residents are going to be at a disadvantage if they're not used to or able to cooperate and interact effectively with people of all races. A fifth mechanism of action for these nudge interventions is that change in behavior is the ability to change the behavioral demands of a situation. Sometimes we have limited perceptions of what we can do in a particular setting. So this is some work that came out of Philadelphia where they went into supermarkets and they put up signs like the two on the left. They put one above the dairy case that was just question for your child, where does milk come from? Then they put the other one in the produce section, which is what's your favorite vegetable? And they had undergraduates hang out near the dairy case and in the produce section and just monitor the kinds of conversations that happened between parents and their preschool children if these signs were in place versus not. And what they found is that if the signs were in place, it made absolutely no difference in middle and upper income neighborhoods. However, if the signs were in place in lower income neighborhoods where families were a little bit more stressed, a little bit more distracted by things like, do I have enough money to cover, all of the food that I need to buy this week? What you saw was a big change in the kinds of conversations that happened with children. Before the signs were up, about 47% of parents and children didn't talk at all when they were in the produce section or in the dairy case section. However, after those two signs, little signs just asking, what other kinds of food comes from cows, you got 65% of parents and children talking, and the mean length of their conversations was 10 utterances, right, or 10 conversational turns. So the mom would say something, ask the question, child would say something, mom would respond, child would respond. So they would have these really elaborate conversations sparked by just the presence or absence of a simple sign, cueing the parents that you can talk to your children about or you can involve your children in conversation in a place like a grocery store. One of the things that I've been trying to think about is, what are some of the other locations in our community where similar posters could be used? I remember before I was a professor when I was in graduate school and having to go to a laundromat, right? That was a really stressful, hard place for families because it was so boring for the children, right? Maybe these kinds of signs could be used there. Or a bus stop might be another kinds of place where we can help parents see that you can use, that conversations are going to make waiting much easier in all of these different settings. We don't even have to be aware of nudge interventions for them to be effective, which is, I think, one of the critical aspects of nudge interventions and one of the reasons that they're so exciting. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit more about brief or light touch interventions. These, the features of these kinds of interventions are that they change a mindset or a fundamental understanding of the situation. My sense is that the very best brief or light touch interventions are ones that change, have a very specific targeted message. So changing one idea that is going to have ripple effects. Right? These brief interventions need to require little effort. They need to be immediately reinforcing and start that virtuous cycle that becomes self-sustaining. I remember when I was in graduate school and I learned about the importance of eating protein. I had been a vegetarian for a few years at that point, but I was not a very serious vegetarian. All I did was stop eating meat, and I didn't really change anything else I had done. And I was feeling tired all of the time. I thought maybe moving to, a different region of the country had activated allergies. I was just feeling a little, like I said, tired and foggy in the head all of the time. And then a friend of mine said, maybe you're not eating enough protein. And we counted up how many grams of protein I was eating each day and realized that it was way too little for an adult to function on. So I started eating cottage cheese, and everything started changing in my life. And so there, just learning one piece of information at a critical time had a profound impact on my physical well-being, right? Other times people will talk about just getting a diagnosis for their children can make a huge difference in their understanding of the situation. That, you know, my daughter's not being impulsive, she has ADHD, and, you know, that's a problem that, you know, we need to figure out, and it really helps make a huge difference. In child and family work, there's a lot of concern about ACEs, or traumatic events, and how they're affecting children. And one of the key things that they're trying to help service providers understand is that if you think about, you know, what's wrong with this child rather than what has happened to this child, it's going to make it much more difficult for you to respond in a benign, kind way. But if you can think about, you know, oh, those behavior problems that are presenting such a challenge to me as a teacher in this classroom are indicative of the issues that this child has faced in his past, it's going to be much more easy to be sympathetic. And so those are some of the features of these light touch interventions or brief interventions that seem to be working the best. Now I'm going to talk about, you know, a few different examples of brief interventions that I thought were especially compelling. One that's pretty famous in my line of work is the family checkup, right? And this has, you know, in the one study that kind of kicked off this area of research, they went into places where families could sign up for WIC, which is a supplemental food program for low-income parents with young children. And they signed up mothers and dyads who had additional risk factors that made it more likely that the child would develop conduct problems. They had 3 visits with each of these families. They did an assessment. They provided feedback about what they had learned on that assessment. And then they also provided a quick follow-up. So how did that feedback go? Do you need, you know, can I help you with any resources? Are there any things that we could talk about that would make your life easier? And then they followed those children from the times that they were 2 to the time that they were 4. And those 3 visits with the family checkup providers allowed mothers to become more involved with their children over time. It also made the children less destructive, less oppositional over those 2 years. And the effects were particularly strong for families with depressed moms and temperamentally difficult children. And we know that that's kind of the very worst combination for children in these settings. And so just 3 quick assessments had, you know, fundamental effects on the developmental trajectories of these high-risk families. Another line of research that has been really interesting is on dialogic reading. So when Head Start teachers and parents learned new ways of reading with 3-year-old children, the effects were pretty dramatic. They watched 2 20 to 30-minute videos, and, you know, the content of these videos was just about how to read with your children. So instead of worrying about, you know, covering every word, getting to the end of the story, parents were told, you know, ask a lot of questions, you know, ask who, what, when questions. Don't just ask yes, no questions. Follow the child's interest and have fun with this book. If you only get through 2 pages of the book, but you have a 30-minute conversation with your child, that's a success, right? That the importance of book reading is not to get through every page, but to have these kinds of conversations. And when parents watched these 2 videos, children in the intervention condition had higher vocabulary scores that were sustained over time. When they just did this with the teachers, they showed effects on sentence complexity and mean length of utterance. And we know that those effects in children are going to have a really, really positive downstream effect on children's language and their ability to pick up reading. And if children become really good readers in kindergarten and first grade, everything else is going to be so much easier for them throughout high school. Here's another brief intervention that I really love. This is an example that I found on YouTube. Let me see if this will work. This is a teacher who has a special handshake with all of the children in his classroom.
You ready? All right.
Yeah, so I love that example. The teacher developed an individual handshake with each of the children in his class. And imagine if that's the way you start your day, and all of the ripple effects that could happen from just that moment of connection. You know, the teacher saying, I see you, you're here, I'm glad you're here, you and I have a special connection. On days when teachers greeted their challenging children as they entered the room, with just, they didn't have to have kind of those special handshakes and dances with each of the child. They could just say things like, I'm glad you're here, or I like your shoes. On days when teachers did that, on-task behavior during the first 10 minutes of class increased from 45% to 72%. The latency to task engagement also decreased, right? So just saying, hello, I see that you're here, can have a profound effect on the way that a child's school day goes. They've also done this kind of study with college professors. And when they stood at the door greeting students as they came in, rather than standing at the podium getting ready to lecture, the performance on a lecture comprehension quiz increased from 67% to 85%. Right, and so in this case, at the end of each lecture, the professor had, a quick 10-point quiz, like what did the students learn in class that day? And the results were pretty dramatic by just changing where the professor was when she or he, changing where the professor was at the beginning of the class period and making sure that the students recognized that the professor knew that they were there. This is another one of my favorite brief interventions where they tried to reimagine healthy behaviors as an act of defiance. So in this case, high school students were taught how corporations were trying to take away their power and lie to them around junk food. That, a lot of the advertisements that they would see for food was trying to make junk food addictive, and it was trying to falsely label the junk food as healthy, right? And so a lot of the food that's specifically targeted for adolescents has high levels of sugar, high levels of salt, high levels of fat, which make it really, really hard to resist, right? But at the same time, they'll say things like all natural, right? Well, sugar's natural, but it's not very healthy. And they taught adolescents this with the goal of kind of making them indignant, making them outraged that they were being duped in this way. And when the teenagers had that lesson in a class one day, and then the next day in a completely different context, unrelated to what they had just learned, they were given a choice of snacks. What they saw was that there was an 11 percentage point, that children were 11 percentage points more likely to choose a healthy snack over junk food the following day. They were 7 percentage points more likely to choose water over soda that second day. And if sustained, those kinds of choices would translate to about a pound of body fat every 6 to 8 weeks. So this is a really powerful mechanism for addressing that childhood and teenage adolescent obesity epidemic that we're seeing in the United States. The particular feature of this study that I really love is that every time adolescents see an advertisement for food that's targeting them, it serves as a booster for this, for what they've already learned, right? That they see, that they recognize the strategies that these corporations are trying to use to make junk food look healthy, and they become outraged all again and even more committed to eating healthy foods in order not to play into the corporation's agenda. My background has always been in these kind of large-scale interventions, and I remember being shocked a few years ago when a colleague of mine did this intervention to reduce college student drinking. So the summer before students left for college, he sent parents a small brochure that just talked about teenage drinking, so that the parents would be, or talked about college student drinking, so that the parents would be informed about the issues. And most importantly, he kind of gave parents language to use to discuss drinking with their students. And so, he gave them permission to ask, what did you do last night? So call them up on a Sunday and just check in, like, oh, what did you do last night? Did you go to any parties? And follow up on the drinking. And what he found was that, if parents had received this brochure the summer before their students had gone to college, then their college students were less likely to drink, they were less likely to get drunk, they were less motivated to go to a party specifically to drink, and they were less likely to report hangovers or other consequences of excessive drinking. So just receiving that brochure in the mail at the moment when it was going to be most useful, the summer before students left the control and the safety of their parents' home, had this huge effect. And this effect size was as big as some of the most extensive research programs that we've ever done on teenage drinking. A few years ago, I was approached by the Pennsylvania Bureau of Juvenile Justice Services about creating an intervention to help promote relationships between youth who were being detained in these kind of basically youth boot camps and their parents. In Pennsylvania, most of the students in these facilities are coming from places like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but the youth camps themselves are located in some of the rural parts of the state. And so it's really hard for the parents to maintain contact with the adolescents while they're away. And that also makes it harder for the parents to support the adolescents' progress once they're reintegrated into the community. So the Bureau of Juvenile Justice Services wanted to see if we could figure out some approach to address that problem. And they actually approached my colleague, Sabrina Doyle, and she and I developed this intervention, this brief intervention, to see how that would work. So the first thing that we did is we tried to help parents see that the place that their children were going to be at was not like a baby prison, but rather a treatment facility. We created this brochure. It looks really positive and pleasant. We created a letter template so that the counselors could introduce themselves to the parents and say, I know that you know more about your child than anybody else, and I'm really eager to chat with you, to learn everything that I can about you and your family, so that I can be the greatest resource possible while he's here or she's here. And I want to introduce myself, give you my telephone number, so that if you ever have any concerns, you can contact me. Right? So just kind of changing that perception of the parents about where the child was going to be and what was possible as a result. While the teenagers were in these facilities, they got one 10-minute phone call with their parents every week. These phone calls had to be monitored by the counselors for safety reasons, but a lot of times the counselors were in the room but not really doing anything. And we recognized that as an opportunity for the counselors to make these exchanges therapeutic, right? And so we created a template or an outline for each of these 10-minute phone calls. We wanted the counselor just to introduce himself or herself, to give a quick overview of the week, like, oh, your son John's, had a great week, he's doing really well, and so forth. And then, make sure that the teenager covered all of these different topics during the phone call, right? So talk about the behavior level that he was on, talk about how school or work training was going, talk about what he was learning in counseling so that his parent would be more knowledgeable about some of the language and some of the content, so that, if the teenager was learning anger management strategies at the youth facility, and then went home and was struggling with anger management issues, the mom may be able to prompt him at the perfect time, like, oh, remember about like that deep breathing. Maybe you should go to your room and try to do that for a couple of minutes. We made sure that the parents shared some news of the home, and then we ended each of these conversations with some compliments. And so the counselor might say something like, I was so proud of John, Mrs. Smith. He did a great job the other day. We were playing basketball. Some other kid got in his face, and he stepped back and said, exactly what he needed to do. That was, just a real sign of his progress. After hearing what he's done this week, what are you most proud of? In order to help the parents learn to feel comfortable giving compliments, to change kind of the tone of the communication between the parents and the children, so that the parents would be better supports for their children once they got back into their communities. And what we saw as a result of creating those letter templates, the introduction templates, the brochures, and these outlines for the calls was that when youth were assigned to this intervention, they were less likely to require hands-on assistance during behavior incidents, right? And if you're the director of one of these youth facilities, this is a really, really critical outcome for you. It's when, these teenagers, and, a lot of them were, very close to age 18, and so fairly big people, had a behavior incident, needed to leave the room. It got really dangerous if they required physical assistance to leave the room, right? That's when the teenagers got hurt. That's when the staff members got hurt. That's when the state would get sued. And it's when staff members would go out on disability, right? And so we were able to show that just changing the relationships between the counselors and the parents and their youth would allow the youth to kind of show quicker, better self-control and require less hands-on assistance. Another brief intervention that I really like is around cultivating gratitude. So in this study, they had every night for 3 times a week for 2 weeks, so 6 times, people would spend 5 minutes writing about what they appreciated in their life. So, things that they might not have acknowledged before or might not have thought about, they just spent 5 minutes writing about that. And after those 2 weeks, women who had completed this practice were more likely to feel happy. They experienced greater reductions in distress. They were more optimistic over time. They reported sleeping better, and they showed greater decreases in blood pressure. So this is another really easy, nice way of using these brief interventions to have a fairly profound impact. And this is, certainly something that you all could use in your work with aging populations. So the point of all of those kinds of studies is that for some families, brief interventions optimally timed can be as beneficial as some of our more intensive programs at less optimal times. There should not be a question mark there. And you know, what I would challenge you all to think about is, are there opportunities to do anything like this in the work that you're doing in Extension? One of the areas that I've been excited about lately is thinking about using brief interventions in our programming, but nudge interventions in the evaluation of those programs to further solidify change. So in one of the interventions that I'm working on right now, we have 10 lessons where parents and children cook a healthy snack together, right? And at the end of each lesson, we have parents complete, these ratings. So I enjoyed today's cooking activity. I gave my child many compliments, which is one of the things that we're trying to get them to do. I gave my child many choices. I spoke to my child a lot during the cooking activity, right? These are all things that we're encouraging the parents to do, and we wanted to create a perception of themselves as somebody who's doing these things because they're endorsing it at the end of the intervention. We started this probably 5 or 6 years ago, but as I've been learning more about some of these brief interventions and nudge interventions and the work in social psychology, I might have changed this a little bit. One of the things that we know is that just kind of fishing for this affirmative yes makes a huge difference in whether people are actually likely to follow through on something. In restaurants, if people make a reservation, but then they don't show up for that reservation, it's really bad for business. The restaurant loses out on, the people who didn't show up on the business for those people who didn't show up for their own reservation, but they've also lost out on the business of other people who would have liked that spot. Typically people, when they call to make a reservation, at the end, the hostess might say something like, please call if you need to cancel reservations, and that's it. But if they changed the wording of that statement to, will you please call if you have to cancel your reservations, everybody said yes, and the no-show rate dropped from 30% to 10%, right? So if the hostess said, will you please call, and the person then said yes, they were much less likely to just not show up by a pretty dramatic percentage. They've also showed the same finding in terms of voting, right? So almost everybody plans to vote. And when pollsters asked young adults whether they would vote in the upcoming election, 100% said yes, and 87% actually voted. However, if they weren't asked whether they were planning to vote, only 61% actually showed up for voting. So just saying, yes, I plan to vote, meant that you were able to increase turnout by 26 percentage points. People are basically motivated to behave consistently with the commitments that they've already made. If they've said yes, that they will do something, they're more likely to do it. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is specifically ask participants whether they will use the strategies that they've learned in our programming. A second nudge intervention that we're thinking about using in our evaluations is making an active commitment by writing it down. So when students were told to complete a volunteer form versus just leaving the form blank if they did not want to volunteer, the same number of students indicated that they wanted to volunteer. However, 49% of the students in the active condition, the ones who had written down, yes, I want to volunteer, actually showed up to volunteer. Whereas if students were told, if you want to volunteer, show up on this day, only 17% students have actually showed up. Customers are less likely to cancel those credit card applications that they have completed on their own compared to the ones that are completed for them. So sometimes in airports, you'll have people standing at those little tables asking if you want to sign up for like a United Visa account. If they fill those out for you, you're more likely to cancel it than if you actually fill it out. They've shown the same effect when patients are given the card to fill out for their next doctor's or dentist appointment, rather than having the receptionist fill it out for them. We want to make an active commitment by writing it down. We want to ask participants to write down how they plan to use what they've learned in your programs. One time I was talking to a colleague about these findings, and she said, I wonder what those implications are for these New Year's resolutions, right? And so it might be, next time you're planning your New Year's Eve party, it might be worth having people actually write down what they're hoping to do rather than just sharing it, because that will make them actually more likely to follow through with it. Here's a handout that we give at the end of one of those lessons on the program that I was just describing about healthy cooking with children. And we have parents write out, these healthy food choices I can give my child this week. So, first one might be apples or orange slices. The parent writes that down. Second one might be broccoli or carrots. Parent writes that down. Third one might be milk or water. The parent writes that down, and then they put this on the refrigerator. And then we're hoping that by actually writing that down, the parents are more likely to follow through on giving their children these choices. Another way of using a nudge intervention and evaluation is to think about the power of one good reason. So they've done these studies where they asked participants to think about BMW or Mercedes, and they knew from past research that people liked both cars, that one wasn't clearly favored or over the other. And when they asked people to name 10 reasons why a BMW is better than a Mercedes, people ended up liking the Mercedes a lot more. It was really hard to come up with 10 reasons why a BMW was better than the Mercedes. And because of that struggle that people had, they thought, oh, it must be that the Mercedes is best. Versus when they were asked to name one reason why you liked a BMW more than a Mercedes, people ended up preferring the BMW, right? So people base their judgments on something, on how easy it is to come up with those good reasons. So, one of the things that we're trying to do in our evaluations is have participants write down just one good reason why it would be good to adopt a new strategy that they've just learned. And one of the other things that we know is that focusing on the benefits of changing appears about twice as powerful as focusing on the consequences of maintaining our current state. Another nudge intervention strategy that we're using is consistency, right? People are reluctant to change the behavior because they don't want to admit that they've been wrong in the past. Or, there's certainly some value in what they've been doing in the past, which is why they've been doing it, right? And so we're teaching them new strategies, new skills, new information. And one of the things that we really want them to do is use that, right? And so our goal here is to help them integrate what they've just learned with what they've already been doing. And so one of the things that we're always asking is, how is what you've learned today consistent with something that you're already doing? So that it will feel a little bit more seamless and they will be less defensive about what they've always been doing. We know that commitments are more likely to be kept if they are public, and that people work hard to minimize that cognitive dissonance, right? That we don't like to not follow through on what we've said we'll do or how we think about ourselves. So participants may be more likely to embrace change if they voluntarily tell others what a great program they've taken. And so here are some sample evaluation questions that we've been using lately that are a little bit different than the kinds of questions that we typically use, but we're hoping that these will make it more likely that participants actually incorporate and do some of the strategies that we've been talking to them about in our programming. And as you can see, these really don't affect the kind of information that we need in order to evaluate carefully the success of our program. So we start out by just getting that kind of affirmative yes. Will you use any of the techniques you've learned today in your own life? Yes or no? Everybody says yes, but it's also more likely that they're going to do it. If yes, why do you plan to use some of those techniques, right? The power of kind of writing things down, thinking about it a little bit more deeply. Can you name just one reason why some of these techniques might improve your own family life? Don't name 10, right? Just one. What techniques are you already using in your life that are consistent with what you've learned today, right? So you've been on, giving them the message, you've been on the right track, and we're just enhancing what you already do well. We want people to think of other friends who might enjoy this program and commit to telling those friends about this program. If they have said yes to these questions the next time they're at a barbecue or run into one of those friends on the front stoop, you're more likely to mention it. And because they've now mentioned the program, they're even more likely to embrace the change concepts that they've learned themselves. They don't want to be a hypocrite to their friend by recommending something that they're not buying into. And so they decrease that cognitive dissonance by embracing the new change even more fully. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take your questions now.
Thank you, Rob. That was wonderful. We can take questions if people want to unmute themselves and speak, or if you want to type in the chat box, I can reiterate those. I know it's hard to do multiple things at the same time for the presenter. So. And we did have a question earlier from Mackenzie about whether the slides will be shared. So this has been recorded and it will be available as an archived presentation on the NCRAN website. Mackenzie has another question. Are there any particular journals you recommend where I could find more information about nudge interventions in family life education? Journals or particular articles?
Yeah, there's some articles. Let me write that down and I will share them with you, Kristen, and then you can pass them on.
Yeah, I can forward them along.
Okay. Yeah, I can't think of I can't think of the reference right off the top of my head, but there are certainly some. And I'm happy to share the slides.
And I know that from my experience, this is such an interesting idea, and I feel like the potential is there so strongly, but putting it into practice is where the challenge happens. And so I think there's a space for a lot of creative thinking and figuring out how do we take this information and operationalize it, turn it into something that we can use, and then also test it to see how it actually works and what doesn't. And so I think there's so much potential there.
Absolutely. And as you and I have discussed, I was so excited to hear about your project to just help orient people about how to have a visit with a relative or a friend in an assisted living facility, right? That's a really hard, awkward situation for a lot of families. And just kind of giving them a script, giving them permission, like, oh, holding hands is really important. Talk about these kinds of things. It's okay to be silent, bring things to look at together.
Yeah.
Right? That those are really, really simple strategies that can make a huge difference. And it doesn't take very long to teach people those things at all, right? That you're doing it in face-to-face sessions, but you could also imagine, even brochures at some point once you get it, get all the kinks worked out.
Yes.
And I just love that idea because that can make a huge difference. If people are not if it feels stressful and awkward and uncomfortable to go visit relatives in these assisted nursing facilities, people are going to be less likely to do it. And everybody's going to suffer as a result.
Mackenzie added, thank you. I'm very interested in combining the science of adult learning with family life education for extension purposes. So this is right up my alley. So Mackenzie, hey, report back when you do some really cool work using this. It'll be interesting for all of us to see. And I think that there is anything that's relating to families or busy individuals with extends from this concept of parents and their children, but also to older adults or grandparents who are raising children or caregivers. There's so many competing demands in a lot of these spaces that I think this idea of things that are brief can be really useful, because we have a lot of these like 6 series interventions and people come for 2 hours a week, and they can be really useful and really effective and also really hard for some people to go to. And so the idea of making it really granular, I think has a lot of potential. So last comment, another comment from Mackenzie here, hopefully doing my doctoral work exploring this realm. Mackenzie, that's great. So excited. Another comment here, I agree, the grandparents and other relatives raising children often look for resources. So there's some gaps where we could, I think, do more to support families and focus on this sort of brief nudge piece, just to make it easier for them to make choices that are helpful for their families.
One of the brief interventions that we've developed here in Wisconsin is around kind of how to talk to children about their strong feelings. So a lot of grandparents who are raising grandchildren grew up in a very different time, and even when they were raising their own children, the kind of science about what was most optimal and most helpful for children has really changed in that time. And so we have a 1 hour presentation that our educators are delivering in jail. Some of them are delivering it online, at PTO events or for Head Start parent meetings, but they could also do it for, something like grandparents raising children support groups, right? About just how do you talk to your child about these strong feelings? In many cases, grandparents are raising their grandchildren, because of unfortunate circumstances, right? That wasn't the plan originally. And so the children have really strong feelings, and the grandparents might be a little worried about opening up that can of worms. And we just, have 2 or 3 basic ideas that we're trying to get the parents or the grandparents to understand. That when your child has a strong feeling, you identify it, you validate it. I would, saying something like, I understand you miss your mom. I miss her too, right? And then sometimes you need to, help the child solve the problem, but a lot of times you don't. That the child just needs to know that somebody understands, some of that. And so I think that any time that we recognize, if just this one thing could shift, there's potential for a nice brief intervention.
And I think that granularity is so important and also so hard.
Right. But I'm surprised when, I talk to, like psychologist friends, and ask them, well, what's the one thing, if you only had an hour with somebody, and you knew that, he was going to, come for one session, but that was it. What are the key points that you would want to make sure that he understood by the time he left? A lot of us have those ideas, but when we're in extension, when we're asked to present, at these kind of one-time presentations, we tend not to focus on that. We tend to provide more education instead of something that's a little bit more experiential, or something that could actually have these kind of positive ripple effects that I was talking about earlier.
So it's a big opportunity. Absolutely. Well, I don't see any more questions or comments trickling in. So I think that we will leave it there. What I'm going to do is put the evaluation link into the chat box. So everyone who's viewing this either now or as a recording, please do fill out the evaluation, because that's really helpful. Again, we are on June 21st right now. This is Rob Nixon. He's talking about brief interventions, and we would love your feedback. But thank you for being here. Dr. Nix, thank you very much for presenting for us. You had a comment.
Great. Yeah, also, my email address is robert.nix@wisc.edu.
And I'm also putting that in the chat box.
Okay, great. If anybody has any questions or follow-up, I'm happy to respond to your emails.
Yeah. Well, and with that, I want to thank everyone. Dr. Nix, I want to thank you. This was a wonderful presentation, and we will see you all next month for our July webinars.